Hi, I just thought I'd like to do a video today after watching a video on YouTube by a guy called Steve Lawson, who's in the John MacArthur camp, and he did a video on, let me just give you the titles so that I don't just... Basically, it was called Calvin's Critique of Charismatic Calvinists. Calvin's critique of Charismatic Calvinists by Steve Lawson. Now, I was curious to watch this because many years ago, and I mean, I am talking many years ago, one of the I think it was about the second church I ever went to. And the first church that I ever really went to for a long time and was committed to was a charismatic Calvinist church, a Reformed church of the charismatic persuasion. So I was interested to listen to his critique of the Calvinist charismatics. Now, I no longer go to a Calvinist or a Reformed church. I'm still a charismatic. I wouldn't call myself a Calvinist, but I would say I'm still of the charismatic persuasion. So I was interested to see what he had to say because, you know, he wanted to say that it was impossible to be a Calvinist and still be a charismatic, and his argument was going to be that he was going to show John Calvin's view and quoting John Calvin, and he quoted from John Calvin's commentaries on Acts and other places. But interestingly enough, none of those commentaries were actually scriptural based. They were just kind of John Calvin's opinion in the commentary. He didn't substantiate why his view was correct. Steve Lawson also tried to say that, you know, Calvin was dealing with issues in his time, and he talked about the libertines and the Anabaptists, and tried to compare the libertines and the Anabaptists to the modern charismatics. Well, there may be some areas you could do that, but generally, I don't recognize, and I've been a charismatic for nearly 50 years, I don't recognize his description of the charismatics Pentecostals that I know. Certainly not with his description of the libertines or even the Anabaptists. We just don't fit into the straw man that he presented as being the charismatic movement. So I think that was the first thing I noticed. So, you know, two things there. There was no real, he purely used John Calvin as his authority. Now, obviously, if you're talking about people who claim to be Calvinists and who are charismatics, that may be valid. But even so, you can take some part of what somebody believes. You don't have to believe everything somebody believes to actually accept a lot of what they believe, and still have other things that you believe as well. You know, the idea that, you know, you can't hold to some of Calvinism's teachings, you know, Tulip, for instance, and be a charismatic, doesn't make any sense. You know, you could do both. Obviously, you couldn't hold to John Calvin's cessationist views. So at that point, you would have to depart from him. But, you know, I don't see that is a big deal, really. That I believe that you could hold to a lot of Calvin's views and still be a charismatic. I mean, charismatic movement has is involved with most major denominations. So, you know, the idea that you couldn't be a charismatic and be a Calvinist in the broad sense, I don't think that he's making a very good case. I mean, he can argue that Calvin was against cessationalists. Well, on that point, yeah, you would depart. The other thing I noticed is that he put, now I'm not an expert on Calvin. I'm not here to critique Calvin particularly. Calvin definitely was a huge influence on the Reformation, and he had a massive influence on the forming of the Protestant church. But the way that he spoke about Calvin was like that Calvin was infallible. And that was really worrying. Whenever you see anybody put on a pedestal where and he said he was the great theologian given to the church. And, basically he was, virtually saying he was infallible. He was a king of commentaries. And yet I don't think that, from looking back over history, I don't think any of the reformers were infallible. I think they all had flaws and faults. They weren't perfect in their theology. And I doubt whether nobody I know is perfect in their theological views, including me. So why would, he was just so putting him on a pedestal. It was almost if he would say, well, Calvin was a greater theologian than Paul, who wrote, a large portion of the New Testament. And there are problems with this as well, because Calvin wrote the Institutes when he had only been a Christian for 2 years, which, when you think about it, isn't much time to really solidify your beliefs. It's not a huge amount. 2 years, you are still fairly young Christian after 2 years. Now, he may have been a great mind, whatever, but I still don't think that 2 years is going to bring you to a place of maturity in understanding the scriptures. Paul certainly needed a lot more time than that. He went off into Arabia, I think, for 13 years. He kind of, Paul went away for a long time, and Paul was an expert in the Old Testament. He knew the Old Testament. He was somebody who really knew the scriptures, and yet he felt it necessary to withdraw and to, work through what had happened to him and to work through his theology. So the fact that Calvin had only been a Christian for 2 years, nobody takes away from the great intellect he had, the great mind he had, his ability to write commentaries. Nobody would deny those things, but we do have to take into account the short time. The other thing I would say is, I think I see in him a reaction to the Catholic Church. And I don't think personally that the Reformation, I think the Reformation was necessary. It had to happen, that a huge amount of good came out of it. But I don't believe by any stretch of the imagination it was a perfect movement. Because, one of the reasons I believe that is for this very reason, that it was cessational in its theology, and it rejected things that actually weren't bad. And the reason it rejected them was maybe because there were abuses at that time, but that doesn't give you a theological reason to reject things. See, one of the things that Steve Lawson was saying is that, charismatics, enter into all kind of abuses. And the same thing that Calvin was saying. He was basically saying these people were, I can't remember the exact terms, they were like empty-headed or woolly-headed or something. They were just, naive people who did things without really thinking, and who really had no interest in the word, which is a caricature, and doesn't really apply to the charismatic movement, not the charismatic movement I know. He also, he compared them to the libertines and the Anabaptists, which I believe is a false analogy. So that was another issue that I felt Steve Lawson was making this false comparison to them. So I see problems. I see problems with Calvin's theology in this area. I mean, you can have correct theology in some areas and have blind spots in the other areas. You know, it's not a given that you are going to be correct in every area. And to critique something purely because you didn't like the way somebody else did it is not a good reason. You know, Steve Lawson and his fellows are from the Sola Scriptura camp. And I assume so was Calvin. Yet Calvin, in none of his comments that Steve Lawson quoted, gave biblical reasons for what he was saying. Scriptural reasons, scriptural evidence. And Steve Lawson never gave any scriptural evidence for what he was saying. His sole source of authority was John Calvin, which is quite strange and funny in a way, because the very people they would critique and say, you know, Calvin was arguing against the papists, whose source of authority was, you know, tradition and the Pope. And yet here was this commentary, these quotes from the commentaries, and Steve Lawson doing the very same thing, although they were calling themselves Sola Scriptura. Now, I'm not saying that Calvin doesn't somewhere else give a theological argument, you know, against cessationalism. I'm sure he does somewhere, but Steve Lawson didn't. His sole source of authority was Calvin. That was the argument. He was using Calvin to attack Calvinists. So, you know, there were just so many things that I disagreed about his approach, because, you know, and there was this unequal scales here. You know, there was this idea that charismatics can abuse, you know, can have abusive practices, but fundamentalists, you know, Calvinists can't. You know, that if you enter into the realm of spiritual gifts, you can go off into, you know, la la land and fall into abuse and error. But the people who just stick to the word can't fall into error. And yet this is such a nonsense, because, you know, as Paul himself said, he said the letter kills. Probably more harm has been done through people who just held to the word and weren't charismatic than people who were charismatic and did crazy stuff. The Pharisees, for instance, were people who held to the letter of the law, and yet they were the ones who called for the death of Christ and to have him crucified. So this idea that, you know, this false dichotomy that, you know, you can be somebody who believes in the word, you know, and you would claim to believe in the Spirit and not fall into error. Well, let's just say somebody of Steve Lawson's camp can't fall into error, but people in the charismatic camp are likely and more prone to fall into error. And again, I think this was a false argument. You know, people fall into error for various reasons, and we need as Steve Lawson tried to say, we can't divorce the word and the Spirit. But I believe that's the very thing that he was doing. He was saying that, you know, and he was saying that, you know, he was implying, you know, this idea that to be a charismatic and a Pentecostal means that you're inventing fresh revelation and new doctrine that doesn't already exist. Well, I don't know any Christians that do that would believe that you can just, you know, ignore the scriptures and just come up with new theology and new doctrines. People have done it, absolutely. You know, people come up with all kinds of interesting doctrines, whether you're charismatic or non-charismatic. I mean, the fact that there are, so many different views in non-charismatic churches, as well as charismatic churches, shows that you're equally likely to have strange views, whether you're a charismatic or a non-charismatic. It's not a given that just because you're charismatic, you're going to go into error. Obviously, I believe that, you need to be based in the word. You need to be reading the scriptures. You can't just rely on experiences that you have. So it was a very unsatisfying video. And I think it was, I just hope that the people that were in the audience thought a bit deeper about the whole matter, because these guys stand there and they just speak as if they're an authority, and they speak with authority. But you've got to look carefully what they say. They were saying that, basically he was painting charismatics as being libertines, immoral, people who didn't know the difference between right and wrong, who, were licentious, slanderous statements against people who, in my experience, love God and want to serve God and want to live a holy life. So, it's a straw manning, and for somebody who claims to be sola scriptura, surely the only position you can take to critique something is by bringing up a biblical argument. Interestingly, there was another video in the whole series where somebody else did exactly that. But basically, there isn't really a theological argument for cessationism. It just doesn't exist, to be honest. And he is as good as admitted that. He said, one of the charismatics' arguments is that, there is no scriptures that say the gifts are ceased. And his answer was, well, there's no scriptures to say they've continued. So he as good as admitted that he didn't really have a scriptural argument for the fact that, for saying that gifts are ceased. And I think we have as a charismatic, have a way better argument to say that they've continued, apart from the fact that the largest growing church and the biggest church and the people who on the face of the planet are the charismatics and the Pentecostals. That doesn't make you right because you're a large group, but it does indicate something, doesn't it? So I just want to lay this out there. I do think that it was a terrible shame that Calvin's theology was weak in that area, that he was a cessationist, and most of the Puritans and the reformers were cessationalists. And I think it was a reaction against the Catholic Church, and they didn't like the miracles, supposed to have been done by the saints in the Catholic Church. And they kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater. Because I think it meant that we had a reformation, but we didn't have a restoration. We had a reformation without a true and complete restoration. But thank God, I believe in these days, we are seeing a restoration of apostles, prophets, pastors, teachers, evangelists, and the gifts of the Spirit. So there we go. That's my brief video I'm going to do. And I may do another one. But interesting to see. I do find this whole area, somebody who's been a charismatic, and see how they're vilified and attacked by people who are our brothers and sisters, to be quite painful, to be honest, and especially when they're relying on using the excesses of a movement to attack the movement, rather than any solid biblical basis for saying it's wrong. I mean, if you go on that basis, then there isn't anything that you can't critique based on the fact that somebody involved in it does it wrong. You know, I mean, that's what the whole letters of the Corinthians and the Galatians, all of those letters were addressed to churches that were screwing things up. So the idea that Christians can't screw things up is a complete nonsense. But to reject the beliefs of any of the doctrines of Christianity, to say that cessationism is the biblical position, you have to have a scriptural argument. And there isn't one. You know, I mean, the prophet Joel said, in the last days, your old men will dream dreams, your young men will see visions, you know, in the last days. Well, we're still in the last days, you know. I mean, there's numerous scriptures I could point out, you know, and there's a whole theology. We're not living in the dark ages, you know. Charismatics and Pentecostals have a pretty well thought out and understood biblical theology of the gifts of the Spirit and the movement of the Holy Spirit. That we don't just believe stuff out of, you know, some weird experience. There's a theology behind it. You know, and I was brought up in a church which was reformed and had a theology of the gifts of the Spirit, had a theology of, you know, the moving of the Spirit. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to post this out there for anyone to watch. And well, you know, feel free to come back, and if anybody at any point wants to have a discussion on this, I'm happy to have a discussion. So I'm just going to pause there, and nice to meet you.